Yeah, welcome to another climate data science lecture from at LEAP. Today we have our very own Katie Dagan, who is a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She received her PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Harvard and a bachelor's in Math and Physics from Brown. Her research interests include modeling the impacts of climate change on land and atmosphere interactions, climate variability, extreme events, and also machine learning approaches for climate science and modeling. So excited to hear your talk, and yeah, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. We also have a contingent here in Boulder, so it's really nice to see everybody in person and online. I'll stand up, but I'll try to make it so you can still see me, just so I can talk to everybody in the room. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about some work we've been doing using machine learning for detection. And we're interested in different sources of extreme precipitation. So I'm going to talk about how we're using these detection algorithms to pinpoint these sources of extreme precipitation and look at some of the climate impacts. And this is work that's funded by the US DOE, and it's part of a larger project group here at NCAR called Catalyst, where we're interested in using climate models to investigate climate variability, prediction on different timescales and extremes. So lots of co-authors with this work. I'll sort of acknowledge people as I go through. Sure, I can do that. Okay. So motivation here, we want to understand the different sources of extreme precipitation. Obviously, extreme precipitation has very significant impacts. These pictures are already, woefully out of date. There's been many sort of sobering examples, most recently in Texas, of course, with the extreme flooding. This is actually in Texas as well, Hurricane Harvey, the flooding after Hurricane Harvey. And this is a photo of the Oroville Dam in California after a large atmospheric river dumped so much water that it broke, or the dam was spilled way open. At the same time, as we want to understand these sources of extreme precipitation, we started getting interested in leveraging these tools for detection, automated detection of features with machine learning. So the classic, non-climate science example of being able to detect a cat versus a dog in an image, applying a technique like that to climate data to be able to pick out features like atmospheric rivers. And so in this project, we're interested in applying and developing machine learning detection algorithms so that we can quickly and automate, the detection of these different features. In this talk, I'm going to focus on fronts and atmospheric rivers, but one of the algorithms that we're using also has the capability to detect tropical cyclones, so we haven't really dug into that data. And then there's some other work from my colleagues thinking about mesoscale convective systems. And so again, we want to detect those features and then connect it back to extreme precipitation causes and think about the climate impacts of those. Okay, so let's jump right into the front detection. This is a project where we collaborated with Jim Baird and Ken Kunkel, both at NC State at the time, and Jim now works for a company called Climate AI. And so they developed an algorithm, which they call DL Front. It's a convolutional neural net based algorithm. And if you want to read more details about it, they have a nice paper on it from a couple years ago. But essentially, it takes surface climate fields and processes that and pulls out the features of different front types. And they had trained this on a specific set of hand-labeled fronts from the National Weather Service, so over the US. And they had trained it with reanalysis data. And what we wanted to do is take that algorithm and apply it to climate model data, which it hadn't been applied to before. And so we're using fully coupled community Earth system model, or CESM, simulations at high spatial and temporal resolution, which is really important for detecting these features. So the first question was kind of like, can we take their out-of-the-box model and apply it to a climate model that it hadn't seen before? And so it turns out we are able to detect fronts of different types over this specific North American domain, because that's where the training data came from. And so this is just an example of kind of looping over a month of output where we've taken the climate model, run it through the machine learning algorithm, and asked it to detect these different fronts. And just more details here on the input fields that are used to detect those. And again, it detects fronts in different categories. And so we're doing this in a historical climate simulation, but we also want to apply it to a future climate simulation as well. But before we do that, we want to really understand the results that we're getting out of the algorithm. How do we assess them for trustworthiness? How do we, really know that we can understand and evaluate these results? Are they actually fronts, or are they just what the machine learning model thinks is a front in the climate model? So how do we evaluate the results? And one thing we can do is compare the climate model results to those hand-labeled front data sets, but it's not particularly useful to compare at an individual time point because we don't expect the model, these are uninitialized CSM simulations, so we don't expect the climate models to perfectly match the observed fronts at any particular time point. But we can calculate statistics over time. So that's what we've done here. We're comparing this metric of seasonal front crossing rates. So basically you can think of it as every grid point, how often is a front of any type sort of passing that grid point. And so the heat map is showing where you have more fronts. It's basically front frequency. And then the different rows are different seasons because we think it's important to look for these synoptic features at how the seasonal, how the seasonal cycle maps onto this. And then the different columns are different data sets. The first column being the hand labels, so no machine learning, the sort of truth that we have. And then the middle column being the model, the machine learning algorithm applied to reanalysis data. And then on the right, we have the CSM model. So we're looking for kind of general agreement in the spatial patterns, the magnitudes of where the fronts are located. And we do see that in general. We see that perhaps the CSM model is under predicting, not getting the strength of the magnitude of some of those frontal hotspots. And some of that's expected based on the differences in sea level pressure, we think, between the model and reanalysis. But in general, we're kind of getting the concentration of fronts in the right place where we think they should be. So now that we've done that exercise, we can take the algorithm and compare it just in CSM world, fronts in a historical climate simulation and fronts in a future climate simulation. And the reason we do this is we want to understand how are fronts changing with climate change. And so that's why I'm showing here the two columns, same graphic I showed on the previous slide for the different seasons of the CSM historical, and then the future simulation. It's easier to just look at the difference, right? And so then you can really tell where these changes are happening. So future minus historical. Again, you think it's important to separate by season because you see quite different responses in the different seasons, and the hatched regions are the significant changes. So in something like Northern Hemisphere winter or spring, we see this kind of westward shift in the location of the fronts, whereas in summer we see maybe northward shift, less significant changes in the fall, but definitely something going on in the summer as well, where we see kind of decreases in fronts over the US. And some of this can be connected to what we would expect with changes in the jet stream under climate change. So especially in summer, if the jet is moving poleward, you would expect sort of a decrease in fronts over this region and an increase further north. Okay, but I've been showing all the fronts sort of grouped together. And I mentioned in the beginning that the algorithm does detect fronts of different types. So let's look at the fronts of different types. But before we do that, a quick maybe reminder, primer on different front types and what they are and what they mean. And I always need to remind myself of this because my background is not synoptic meteorology. So I learned a lot about fronts doing this work. So cold fronts are pushing cold air under warm air. You often associate with heavy storms, heavy thunderstorms. Warm fronts are kind of the opposite. Warm air is sliding up over cold air, and you tend to get more sort of drizzling, overcast conditions. Stationary front is where the two air masses are kind of facing off, and one's not really overtaking the other. So you tend to get cloudy conditions, maybe lingering rain. And then occluded fronts, more complex situation with the sort of interaction between cold and warm fronts. I'm not really going to talk about these because they're so infrequent in the algorithm that we used. But just for completeness, I wanted to show all the different types of fronts that the detector can detect. Okay, so let's look at the changes by front type. So I already showed this plot of the future climate minus historical changes. Let's break it down by front type. So we saw and we found that stationary fronts were the primary contribution to the overall changes in fronts. And then I've just highlighted a few regions where you really see the changes in stationary fronts mapping onto the total changes. If you look at cold fronts, you see that's actually where a lot of the decreases in fronts are coming from. So again, some particular regions for certain seasons that you see mapping onto the total, for example, sort of winter eastern US decrease in fronts. And then for warm fronts, there are some contributions. I want to note that the color bar changed quite a bit here, like basically in half, because the frequency of warm fronts is generally lower, so the changes are smaller, but there are still some significant changes that you can see sort of mapping onto the total. So all three of those were important, but most of the changes were coming from stationary and cold fronts. Okay, so what about the changes in circulation associated with these changes in fronts? We can do that because we have these model simulations where we've detected the fronts, but then we can go and look in the climate model and look at changes in circulation and try to understand if that makes sense with what we're seeing in the changes in fronts. So here I'm showing just for DJF, that same picture of the sort of dipole response and decreases in the eastern US and increases in the western US. And this makes sense with what we see in the circulation. We see a similar response in the upper level zonal wind. So this is 300 millibar zonal wind, decreases in the eastern US, increases in the western US. That's also associated with an anomalous trough in the western US. So kind of a warmer air mass versus a colder air mass. And that sort of makes sense where we see the increases in fronts versus the decreases in fronts. And also decreased sea level pressure over the western US. And then I won't show all the seasons just for time, but I think it's interesting to contrast that with the summer changes where we saw mostly decreases over the US with some sort of maybe northward shift in the front locations. And that shows a very different signature in the circulation changes. We have mostly decreases in upper level zonal wind, this sort of broad positive geopotential height anomaly, so warmer air, and an increase in sea level pressure. Okay, so, but what about precipitation? I started out motivating this by we wanted to look at the precipitation associated with those features. So far, we've just been looking at the changes in the fronts themselves and the circulation, which is important as like sort of a baseline to understand what's going on in the model, but you can also look at precipitation. And so this is an image that was taken a snapshot of one time point of output from the front detector. And I've mapped onto that the extreme precipitation, so the 90th percentile precipitation at that same time point from CESM. And what I think is interesting about this is you see areas where the extreme precipitation lines up very nicely with the front, and then you see other areas where perhaps it doesn't, which just points to the fact that there's other sources of extreme precipitation other than fronts. This is probably some sort of convective system or something in the central US this summer. So just to make that point, and also I'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, so if we want to do something fairly straightforward, and there's lots of ways to associate precip with fronts, but we kind of took the most straightforward approach, which is just to say the grid points in the model output where there's a front detected. Let's take the precip at that same grid point and call that frontal associated precip. And then we can do a calculation where we look over time and say, okay, here's all the precip associated with fronts. What percentage of the total precip is that frontal precip? And so that's what I'm plotting here. Again, for CSM historical and CSM future with the different seasons. And so you see frontal precipitation mostly in the eastern US and then in some seasons in the West Coast. But then you have sort of this like lower region in the Western US where we wouldn't expect a lot of fronts. So this all kind of makes sense. And then let's look at the delta because it's easier to see the differences that way. And it turns out we see mostly decreases in the total precipitation associated with the front, particularly in the eastern US. In the paper, we go into more detail about the decomposition of frontal frequency versus frontal precipitation intensity. It turns out it's mostly the frequency that's driving these changes across seasons, but for some seasons and regions, the actual frontal precipitation intensity plays an important role. But I'm not going to go into those details today for time, but this was one way of sort of quantifying the changes that we expect in precip associated with a front. So mostly decreases over the US. This is total precipitation. What about extreme precipitation? I talked about the 90th percentile before. So thanks to a very helpful reviewer of this paper, they introduced me to this metric called the probability ratio, where you can kind of calculate this conditional probability of extreme precipitation given a front relative to the total overall probability of extreme precipitation. So what this can tell you is if you have values of this ratio greater than 1, then you could say, okay, the extreme precipitation is more likely to be associated with a front versus the opposite be true if you have values less than 1. And here again, I'm defining extreme as greater than the 90th percentile at each grid point in season, but we did test different levels. It was broadly the same results. Okay, so let's look at those maps. And this is probably the most challenging color bar I ever had to design in Matplotlib, but I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. So what I wanted to highlight here is that sort of as you get closer to 1, you sort of have less of a response in this metric. But as you get further from 1 in either direction, you're either saying, okay, these regions, the extreme precipitation is more likely to be associated with the front. And then the opposite is true as you get values closer to 0. So similar to the total precip maps, we see that the eastern US, you have more likely extreme precip is associated with the front, and then some of the extreme like coastal regions in winter and spring. And then you see these lighter colors in the middle and sort of the western US topographical regions, places where we wouldn't expect fronts to be. Now doing the delta of this was tricky because of the color bar. So I'm just showing them side by side because I think it's clearer to show it that way. And I guess on the screen, it's a little hard to tell, but we did kind of qualitatively think that there's less green in the future picture and maybe an increase in this sort of area where you see the lighter colors in pretty much all the seasons. And so from that, we could conclude that extreme precipitation associated with fronts is generally over the US in this model, generally decreasing with climate change. But at the same time, we know that in this model, extreme precipitation over the US is generally increasing as a whole. So what that is telling us is there's likely other sources that are contributing to that potential change in extreme precipitation. And some of those things I alluded to, extratropical cyclones, mesoscale convective systems, ARs, could be responsible for that increase in precipitation. And so that's all I'm going to say about the fronts work. The citation is here if you're interested. But kind of using this last point here as a motivation for looking at a different feature, and that feature that we're going to look at is atmospheric rivers. To do that, we're going to use a different machine learning algorithm, and it came from a project called ClimateNet, which was started at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, a DOE lab in California, where they wanted to collect a community-sourced, expert-labeled data set of climate features such as atmospheric rivers and tropical cyclones. So this is a screenshot from the website-based tool where literally had people go in, hand label these features, use that to be a training data set for a machine learning algorithm. And this paper has all the details on how that data was collected. There were several labeling campaigns held at workshops and conferences. We held one here at NCAR back in 2019. And so all of that data from experts going in and hand labeling these features went into building a machine learning model to automatically detect those features in other data sources. So that's what we're using here. And just, if you're interested in how this actually worked, here's an animation showing how someone could actually go in and label these features. The users could toggle between different output fields depending on what they found most informative to be able to label the features. So it was water vapor, winds, pressure, drawing the boundaries, labeling them as either an atmospheric river or tropical cyclone. And then something I found interesting about this was users could submit confidence levels about how confident they felt about labeling the events, which is not really something that is included in our analysis, but I think it would be interesting either through this data set or future data sets to actually be able to use that information about how confident users were in labeling a feature. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the training data. Again, the architecture, a few citations here if you're interested in the original ClimateNet architecture, which was kind of a complex, deep lab-based network architecture. But we're actually, in this work, we're actually using a lighter weight version of it called CGNet, which is a convolutional neural net. And all the details are in this first citation here. So some of the original members of this collaboration kind of created this lighter weight version of the model. And we like it because it's faster, it's more scalable, it has a lot fewer training parameters, trainable parameters. And at the same time, they introduced a feature for being able to track the events over time. And I'll get to this more later in the talk. But basically, when you have these detection algorithms, it's just producing a single time point snapshot. And there's no information necessarily connecting the events over time. But you can do some analysis post hoc and actually, connect a certain feature over time as like an event. So we'll talk about that in a few slides. And all the code is on GitHub, which also really helped us implement this. So again, similar to the fronts work, we wanted to take this algorithm, maybe do some retraining, but apply it to climate model output that it had not seen before. So this fully coupled CESM simulations at high spatial and temporal resolution. So we can look at another movie. This is now we've got a global extent here because the algorithm was trained globally, though primarily the atmospheric rivers are mid-latitude features, and I'll get back to that at the end. We're thinking about polar regions now, but you can see the interaction and the evolution of these different features over time. Again, this is like a month of output kind of looping at the beginning of the historical simulation that we used with CSM. There's an interesting thing that happens with this tropical cyclone here off the coast of Japan, where it morphs into an atmospheric river, which I think is kind of cool, and maybe saying something about genesis of these features. But for this work, we've really just focused on the atmospheric rivers and primarily on a single region, but there's a lot that you could do with this data set and more information on the fields that are used to detect and some details on the simulation there. Okay, so two things that I want to emphasize first. One is that a lot of data processing went into generating this animation, and I'll go through the steps of that because I think it was a lot of work for several different people, and I want to acknowledge that. It wasn't just, plug and play, get this, nice animation. And then similar to the fronts work, we want to make sure we are evaluating and assessing the detection of ARs in CSM. So I'll talk about how we're doing that as well. Okay, so the data processing workflow, I want to acknowledge Tegan King and John Truesdale, both at NCAR, for their work on this. So we start from this place of, okay, we've got these hand labels coming in. There's a quality control process that has to happen with that because sometimes people accidentally label something or they don't complete, something like that. So we want to make sure we do some quality control. So then we end up with these process data sets where we have masks that are, tracing out features, hand labels, and then we have the underlying climate data like the water vapor and the winds and such that we use to label those. And we can separate that into training and test data over different time periods. And we can use that to train this lightweight version of the ClimateNet model. We also do this for different numbers and combinations of input fields just to test the sensitivity of the importance of those fields. And I'll show a little bit of those results in a few slides. So that's sort of one leg of the data processing. The other leg that took quite a bit of time was processing the high-res CSM output. So we had these different model periods and conditions that we wanted to look at, the future climate scenario, the historical simulations. We had to process the input fields in a specific way to match what the machine learning algorithm expected. In some cases, this was pretty straightforward. It just was raw output from the climate model. But in other cases, we had to interpolate things, calculate fields that weren't necessarily native model outputs. These CSM simulations were run on an unstructured grid, so we had to map those to a regular grid for the machine learning model, do some time separation, things like that. So this actually took quite a bit of work. Once we have those two legs together, we can run the process data through the machine learning algorithm and actually generate these results and then get to do the cool science. But another thing I want to note here is that this sort of foray into unstructured grids with CSM was kind of my first experience dealing with this. It's going to become the norm with the CSM model going forward. So I think a lot of us are going to have to learn how to deal with this and also tools for dealing with it. So through a group here called the Earth System Data Science Collective Community of Practice, we did some playing around with how to analyze and visualize this kind of output in Python, and ended up writing a blog post about it if you're interested. And that's just kind of an aside of like, we were doing this work, but we also discovered something in the tooling that we needed to kind of think carefully about, and hopefully it's going to help us going forward with more Python-based tools. Okay, so I mentioned that we trained on a different set of input fields. So I want to show some results across those different iterations of the model training. And these are global maps. I'm going to get to the regional stuff later, but just to show kind of a broad overview of the overall frequency of atmospheric rivers and tropical cyclones in the CSM historical simulations where we trained on all 4 input fields. Comparing that to a model trained on just, so TMQ, I should have defined this before. TMQ is total precipitable water in the column, the water vapor in the column, atmosphere column, and the V winds at 850 hectopascals. Roughly similar. You don't see a lot of differences between these 2 iterations of the trained model. Once you drop to just TMQ, just the water vapor, you see that the AR detection still works, but the TC detection breaks. So the TC detection really needs the winds. The AR detection really relies heavily on water vapor, which we sort of already knew from atmospheric river research, but it was nice to be able to demonstrate that with this model. Okay, and that's all I'm going to say about TCs. We're going to kind of switch the focus to ARs. Well, first I'm going to show this plot. And this is sort of thinking about that second question of how we evaluate the model results. So we have in the first column here a set of time points and the actual human labels. So you can see how humans traced out things like atmospheric rivers. And then the associated predictions from the machine learning model for that time point test set. So different experts label different time points with an asterisk there. And you can also compare that. So you can say, okay, are these, you can kind of look at the features and how they compare across these different columns, but then you can also take the underlying climate data that the user saw and say, okay, did that make sense? Should there have been an atmospheric river there? We can kind of see that in the water vapor. So those are some qualitative ways to evaluate the results. A subtlety here is that this is actually the same time point. And I did that intentionally because sometimes 2 different experts ended up labeling the same time point, but then you have kind of a nice example of like 2 different humans' interpretations of ARs at the same time. So it came from the same data, but you can see there's subtle differences in how they were labeled and also how the machine learning interpreted them, though these are very similar. There's very few differences. Okay. So qualitative assessment of the model. Formally, we do this in the training with a metric called intersection over union, which is looking at like how these masks kind of compare, and you can calculate a loss function based on that. And that's how you can, assess if your model is skillful. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But now I want to switch to some results. So I've already showed this plot. This is the AR frequency over the globe of the CSM historical simulation on the left. But we can also compare this to AR frequency in mirror reanalysis. That's panel B in the middle there. And then a third comparison, or second comparison, I guess, is the CSM future simulations of your RCP 8.5. So the changes are in the bottom. So interestingly, the MERA results, the hotspots are the same, but the deltas are quite different in terms of MERA. There's more ARs detected. This is the same algorithm run on two different, climate model versus reanalysis. And we're still digging into why that might be in terms of the model and reanalysis differences and things like sea level pressure and winds and water vapor. And possibly a source of issue could be some of the gridding that we've done. We're still digging into that result. I am going to talk a little bit more about the results on the right, which are the difference between the future and historical climates, where you can see that there's areas of increase and areas of decrease depending on where you are in the globe. But we're going to zoom in. There's a lot to look at here, right? And so we're going to just zoom in on the Western West because this is a very relevant region for ARs. Okay, so if we zoom in on that region, and we also decompose the changes by season, because we were just looking at annual maps before, you can see that there's broad areas of decrease, especially in the Pacific Northwest, kind of coming onto the coast there, and the Pacific Ocean, in terms of the number of the frequency of ARs, and then some increases in certain seasons in places like Southern California. So that's interesting to us, and we want to kind of understand that a little bit more. And when you look at a map like this, it's, you're kind of trying to understand what's going on over land. The changes in ARs over the ocean are interesting, but they're less relevant for impacts. So we were kind of thinking, okay, what metrics or calculation can we do to really understand what's going on over land? So let's further zoom in. I'm going to do a calculation just sort of in this coastal region, and I'm going to use a metric that's used by the atmospheric river research community, where you can count the number of ARs sort of hitting the coastline. So we're going to do that over that specific region. And I'll just orient you to how we did that calculation here. So now we're taking a zonal mean, so a mean over longitudes of that region. And so latitudes on the x-axis. You have to kind of like flip yourself when you're thinking about how this is aligned with the California coast. So Southern California, Pacific Northwest here. And the metric here is the percent of time with an AR along the coast. So just doing counts at coastlines. So several interesting things here. So the shape of it, you see this peak in around 45 degrees north, and then like a secondary peak around 50, 52 degrees north. You see similar shapes across the different data sets that we're using. So similar to the global maps, the historical simulation is in blue, the reanalysis is in green, and you see pretty good agreement with the model historical and reanalysis until you get to some of those higher latitudes, and you actually see an under prediction of MERA versus CSM, which is kind of different than the global picture where we saw more ARs in MERA, which is just pointing to the importance of zooming in on a particular region, I think, for this kind of analysis. And then the orange line is the RCP 8.5 changes. So mostly decreases, I would say, except some increases at the lower latitudes. Okay, so the reason that I want to calculate this metric is because I wanted to put these results with the CGNet model in the context of other methods of detecting ARs. And there's a lot that we can draw on from this project called ARPMIT, which is the Atmospheric River Tracking Method Intercomparison Project. It's quite a mouthful. Where they have compared dozens of different ways of detecting ARs, not necessarily with machine learning. In fact, most of them don't use machine learning. They use things like thresholds of water vapor, winds, or shapes of these features. But we can kind of put the results that we're getting from ClimateNet or CGNet in the context of these other algorithms. And I've waited to reveal this plot because it's a little overwhelming. You'll see quite a lot going on. But the line that we're looking for to put our CGNet results in context is sort of this pink dot dashed line, which see if you can find it in this plot. But so what this is saying is there's a huge spread in these different detection algorithms. Again, I've tried to do it as apples to apples. So it's the same region, it's the same latitudes, it's the same metric. The difference here is all these different algorithms are using reanalysis data, so there's no climate model data here. And most of them aren't machine learning based, but CGNet is in here. And it's actually, I know you guys can't see this online, but it's actually sort of middle top. You can see the peak here. So a couple of things. A lot of the shapes are similar to this sort of bimodal distribution that we're seeing here. But CGNet tends to be on the higher end. And so we would characterize this as more of a permissive AR detection algorithm, and that it's going to detect ARs more frequently than some of the other methods. And so that's just something to keep in mind when we're doing this analysis. And that could have to do also with the training data and, you know, how often humans label atmospheric rivers versus some of these other quantitative methods, and even things like how big the shape of the outline humans are drawing. I was talking to someone recently who pointed out that could be a reason for some of these, you know, higher results that we're getting with ClimateNet. Okay, so we can leverage ArcMIP to sort of evaluate take the context of this algorithm relative to other methods. Okay, now I want to talk about the event tracking that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. So again, when we're getting the output from the machine learning model, we're just getting time points, and we're getting these masks, and we can make these movies, but we don't really understand like what is a single event. We need to connect that over time. So we've used some scripting to run an analysis after the results from the machine learning model to actually connect individual events. And then what you can do is make plots like these, which are showing the genesis and termination locations of the events. So it's basically saying, where did the ARs start and where did they end, like as a complete feature? And again, what you might expect from AR sort of crossing the Pacific Ocean is that the genesis is focused here in the Western Pacific, and the termination is sort of spread out with a high concentration when you make landfall, which makes sense. And the two columns are the historical versus the future. Let's look at the delta because it's easier to see the differences. So a bit of noise in these results here, but I think two things that I found interesting were the shift in the genesis location, sort of shifting northeastward off the coast of Japan there. And also in the termination, we see sort of a southeastward shift along the California coast. And that agrees with some of the results we saw in overall frequency changes. I haven't talked about the precip yet, but yeah, we'll see that in the precip too. Another way of looking at the event tracking results is to look at these histograms across different metrics of ARs. So here I'm showing a histogram of the lifetime of ARs. 12 hours was the minimum that they sort of hard coded into this algorithm. You can you know, debate that, I guess, but that's why the cutoff here is 12. And you see most of the events are in this sort of 12 to 24 hour lifetime with a steady decrease as you go to longer lifetimes. And this one in the middle is distance, so how far it's traveling. We actually see sort of a peak at just before 3,000 kilometers and then a steady decline. And then you can do the distance over hours to get the speed histogram. It's just that calculation. But I'm showing here the blue is the historical and the orange is the future because I wanted to sort of probe the changes over time. And I think what we can draw from this is that, at least for this tracking method of calculating specific events, we're seeing an increase in longer lived ARs because we're seeing this sort of increase in the orange bars relative to the blue bars that are traveling further at higher speeds. So that's one way of sort of probing the individual events and thinking about how that might relate to impacts. Okay, how about precip associated with ARs? I haven't talked about that yet. Here's another snapshot of an AR event in the Western US with total precipitation mapped onto that. We do the same sort of calculation that we did with fronts, where we take at each grid point in season, we look at the total precip and we look at relative to that, the specific precip that's co-located with an AR. And we can do that at each season. So here we see near year-round increases in the AR precip in Southern California, and some decreases in the Pacific Northwest. So that sort of termination location shifting, the changes in frequency are all, I think, contributing to this increase in the AR precipitation that we're seeing. And just a few more slides here before we wrap up. I'm still working on how to quantify the extreme precipitation associated with ARs. I wanted to do the same calculation of the probability ratio as the fronts. I'm not sure that it's as useful here visually. I mean, you can see there's lots of areas that are whited out. And that's actually because there's no ARs that pass through those locations in the entire data set. So you get to divide by 0 when you do the probability ratio. Unlike fronts where you can sort of see like this even spatial coverage. But that's sort of interesting on its own to really pinpoint like where the locations are that matter for ARs. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I've tried to summarize a few points here. The masked locations, the extreme precipitation is more likely to be associated with an AR at the coast, so the darker green colors, which makes sense. There's some regions and seasons, if you compare the two columns, where we might see an increase in this metric. For example, in the Southwest US during spring, maybe Western Canada in fall, while others show a decrease. So we're still kind of thinking about how to best quantify these results and what they mean for the impacts and the other changes that we're seeing in the climate model. Okay, last little bit of a plug for some ongoing work that is being led by Christine Shields and Tegan King here at NCAR. So we've been talking about these ARs that have been detected with this tool where humans went in and saw like sort of a rectangular map. But one of the downsides of that is that we didn't really get a lot of high latitude ARs. And a lot of that is just like the view that the user was seeing in the tool. So we've developed other tooling to capture human labels from the polar region, so Antarctic and Arctic. And Christine has been doing a great job publicizing this. They've got hundreds of labels so far for these two different regions. And now we're thinking about, okay, what can we do with this data? Can we train additional machine learning algorithms to be able to detect these polar specific ARs, which we think is important because they have different mechanisms and they have different impacts. For example, like, rain on snow events in Antarctica and things like that. And so Tegan made these heat maps, very preliminary, but just showing no machine learning here yet, but just the frequency from the human labels. So you can see kind of like the hotspots of where ARs are in Antarctica and the Arctic, which was new to me to sort of learn where ARs are happening in these high latitude regions. So hopefully more to come on that very soon. Okay, so to summarize, we're using these detection algorithms. I've shown some work where we've looked at fronts and atmospheric rivers and climate models. It's hard to summarize all the kind of subtle regional changes, but overall, the frontal precipitation was decreasing over the US, while we saw AR precipitation increases in Southern California. So lots of potential impacts there for things, flooding and things like that. And then some of the ongoing work that we're doing is collecting these labels and training models for polar specific algorithms. And then I want to emphasize that throughout these projects, this wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration between the domain scientists and the machine learning experts. So that was really helpful. Okay, thanks very much for your attention. There's a question in the room here. Yeah, DJ?
Yeah, it's really interesting talk. I have a implementation question. When you're applying the tracker to future climate, are you using the same like normalization values as in current climate, or do you use different like means and standard deviations in future climate?
We talked about this a lot and we tested both, and I got a slide on this because I can't remember which we decided to do. Let's see if I have it. Oh no, this is for weighted. Yeah, this is not what you're asking. Oops. But we I believe we use the historical
Okay.
means and standard deviations. Yeah, but I can double check that because it did change the results quite a bit. Yeah. I see there's a hand up online.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, great talk, Katie. This is Isaac Gerg from Climate AI. So I noticed that you guys are using convolutional neural networks, which traditionally had their foundation and kind of precipice in computer vision. In computer vision, there's a lot of thought put into pre-training models. So coming to a good initialization state before you actually start training on the data that you care about. Is any of that stuff carried over into what you're doing here with this atmospheric river regression?
I don't think so, in that we're not updating the weights. And there's just really one pass over the training data, the human labels that we have over a very specific time period of labeled data. So I don't think there's anything more beyond that, but yeah, I'd be interested to hear if there's ways to get better skill out of the model by updating weights or doing any sort of retraining.
Yeah, my initial thought would be that if you did some kind of self-supervised pre-training with a large corpus of data, and then you did that first, and then that could be on anything. It could be cats and dogs from ImageNet or something. Doesn't really matter. It could be fractal data. And I would be curious to see as you start training after that pre-training step, how that affects your convergence and also your generalization. So thanks for the good talk.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I guess I'll just add that I don't know the extent to which the initial architecture, because I wasn't as involved in that process, but the choice of the initial architecture based on the existing literature could be a little bit of what you're talking about, like based on these other examples outside climate data and then applied to climate data. But that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Katie. Really,
We have a question in the room in New York, and then we have a question here as well.
Hi, Katie. Really interesting talk. I was wondering, could you just, I don't really have a context for the atmospheric river. But these changes you're showing, are they like significant compared to say like internal variability? Like, are these really extreme changes or?
Yeah, good question. I think that they go beyond what we would expect in internal variability, but that's more of a kind of a gut feeling. And as you saw, there's a huge spread in. Somebody's unmuted on Zoom. There's a huge spread in the different detection methods of atmospheric rivers. So it's difficult. You have this sort of challenging baseline of what even is an atmospheric river. And it's helpful when you can sort of use one algorithm and apply that to future versus historical climate. But if you use a different algorithm, you might get a very different delta. And so that's kind of what ArtMIP is also trying to do, is to assess the overall space of these algorithms and maybe not fully be able to answer that question, but at least give some context for when you're using a specific tool and the caveats that you have to be aware of. Okay, let's go to Sarah's question in the room here.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting talk. I thought the part about like tracking the atmospheric rivers spatiotemporally was really interesting. I was wondering like if there was like any physical explanation for like the geographic differences in the impact of climate change on ARs.
Yeah, I think we have to think about that more as we're writing this up. And I would start by looking at changes in circulation in the model. I think we saw with the fronts that if you see these jet shifts poleward, that could be the reason for some of the AR genesis shifting northward. But you would also probably have to consider what's going on in the Western Pacific in terms of ENSO or MJO? Is that mapping onto any of these changes? So that's the sort of what I would look for physical mechanisms in the genesis. And then in the termination, yeah, having that sort of shift southward, I think we also have to dig into that a little bit more in terms of, you know, how far the ARs are persisting when it's warmer and possibly more moisture in the atmosphere. Why you're getting that direction is not really something that I've looked into, but yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering if the results were sensitive to the choice of machine learning model or seed, or if this was tested out of curiosity.
Didn't really test different machine learning models. The seed, we're not seeing a huge impact in terms of the broad, significant changes in the frequencies and you know, where the events are detected in the sort of large scale picture. But haven't tested different architectures. Sudhanshu goes.
Such an informative talk. Actually, as in the West, we see like atmospheric rivers are influencing the precipitation in the West, right? So can you like think of a similar pattern being observed using Bermuda high pressure systems in the Atlantic Ocean that influences the eastern part of US? Because they influence, because like the precipitation changes in the east because of the Bermuda high pressure systems and how they shift from like lower part to the upper, right?
Yeah. I think you can get ARs in the Atlantic, but they're traveling like towards Europe. And so another region that our MIP has focused on is like Western Europe. But you're asking about the East Coast of the US. Yeah. So I would think like tropical cyclones or extratropical cyclones kind of spinning off of tropical cyclones or fronts would be more impactful in those regions. Mostly over land. I mean, I guess the tropical cyclones over the ocean. But so that's what I would look to explain kind of those changes in precip, like what we saw with the fronts work, but there was more precip changes in the eastern US.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering if you noticed like any bias between like the human labeling of like the ARs and the tropical cyclones and like identification algorithms, like with something like over labeled or under labeled compared to the algorithms.
Yeah, so that crazy line plot was maybe getting at this a little bit, and just that the machine learning algorithms tend to label ARs more frequently than some of the traditional metrics. But then the second part of that is biases coming from the humans doing the labeling. And this is sort of what I was alluding to in that, like, humans might draw an outline that's larger than the actual feature itself. And so we have to think about how that might map onto the results in like a larger area as being labeled as an AR, where maybe that's not all of the ARs, like smaller. So yeah, two things that could help answer that. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot more you could dig into with the completeness of the human labels versus the data, the climate data that we have.
Ask another question.
Sure, yeah.
I was interested to see the increase in stationary fronts in the kind of along the Gulf Coast, and I guess in a couple other areas there seemed to be some indication of potentially, I guess, decreased frequency of front passages. I wonder, how does this align at all with any theories around like slowing down of circulations, or is there too much variance in the data to make any firm conclusions on that?
Okay, so this is what you're talking about?
Yeah, it was like because there's the increase in stationary front spots along the Gulf Coast and then also along the kind of New England coast, and sort of paired with, I guess, can you show the other fronts as well? There's also like a general decrease in cold fronts.
Yeah.
But I wonder, is there any implications on that, and how is there any other evidence that supports, at least in the model, that the circulation, do you see any circulation slowing down at all? Or like other, like, if you do extratropical cyclone tracking, does that also slow down or,
Yeah, I don't know about the ETCs, and it's hard, right, because a lot of fronts and ETCs are connected, so I came across that quite a bit in the literature, trying to understand how these changes in fronts that we were seeing are relative to other ways of detecting fronts, and a lot of times those two features are combined, so that's kind of pushing my knowledge of what a stationary front actually is and how it intersects with an ETC versus other front types. I guess we could look at the changes in circulation. I only have it for DJF and JJA to see if anything pops out. I didn't really focus on that Gulf Coast region. I guess I would imagine that tropical cyclones would have quite an imprint there. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, you see different zonal wind responses in the winter versus the summer. And it's kind of hard to tell here, but you see kind of increases in the winter and decreases in the summer in that region. There you're kind of right on the border of winter. So
I also wonder if it's just like you get more precipitable arc, like more evaporation coming off the Gulf in the winter compared with before. If you're going to have warmer winters, then you would have more evapotranspiration or more evaporation, and thus, like your precipitable, like since it's kind of a bathtub essentially, you're just filling up the bathtub a bit higher. I wonder if that's partially where we're seeing the stationary front increasing is just have kind of this coastal feature that's just becoming much more pronounced or moving further north. But then if you're not having as many cold front intrusions, like especially in the winter, you're getting a lot of, usually it's the cold air outbreak, polar vortex kind of just like breaking apart. If those are changing, then that may lead, like you may have fewer intrusions and thus more stationary fronts.
Yeah, fewer cold fronts. Yeah. You do see in fall as well. Yeah.
So some interesting things going on there.
Yeah.
Seems like.
Any other questions at LEAP or online?
Yeah, I don't see any online. Last call for a question in the room. Okay, well, we are right at 1:30 on the dot, so perfect timing. Thank you again so much, Katie, for the great talk.
Thank you so much, everyone.